When Sarah Palin leaned into the microphone with that familiar smirk, and then, with a tone that carried more venom than wit, she delivered the line that would ignite the entire night, a cheap, cutting jab about Jasmine Crockett's appearance. For a moment, time itself seemed to stutter. The words hung in the air like smoke after a firecracker, acrid, impossible to ignore. Gasps rippled through the audience. Some covered their mouths, others shook their heads. Even the host shifted uncomfortably in his chair, as if unsure whether to laugh along or stop the circus unfolding before him. Palin, however, seemed satisfied, basking in the echo of her own cruelty, mistaking the stunned silence for approval. It was classic Palin theater performance over principle, insult over argument. To her, politics wasn't about truth or progress. It was about spectacle, domination, and keeping the spotlight at all costs. In that instant, she wasn't debating ideas or policies. She was reducing the moment to a playground taunt, a smear meant to belittle not just Crockett, but the millions who saw themselves reflected in her. For Crockett, the target of that barb, the insult could have landed like a dagger. Because for women of color in politics, appearance is never just appearance. It becomes code for respect, for legitimacy, for whether their voices deserve to be heard in the first place. Palin's mockery wasn't just about one woman's looks. It was an attack on identity, dignity, and the very idea that someone who looked like Jasmine Crockett could stand shoulder to shoulder with America's most visible figures. The studio was holding its breath. Crockett's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, her posture steady, calm, unbroken. She didn't flinch. She didn't give Palin the satisfaction of even a blink of shame. That quiet composure spoke louder than 1,000 rebuttals. And yet beneath that stillness, everyone could feel it. Something was coming. The audience knew it, the cameras sensed it, and Palin herself, though she wouldn't admit it, must have felt it too. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't about to let that insult define her moment. But what came next turned the studio and the internet upside down. Insults in politics are nothing new. America has witnessed its fair share of sharp tongues and cutting one-liners, from fiery debates to late-night soundbites. But Palin's comment struck a different chord, one that resonated deeper than partisan sparring. Because when a politician attacks appearance, it isn't just about one person's hairstyle, clothes, or facial expression. It's about signaling who belongs and who does not. It is a weapon wielded to strip away legitimacy, to shrink an opponent into something less than serious, less than worthy, less than American. That's why the room seemed to shift after Palin's remark. This wasn't merely a jab at Crockett's look, it was a thinly veiled message about who is allowed to occupy power, and who must be mocked for daring to step into the arena. In a nation that promises liberty and justice for all, such ridicule cuts against the very grain of American ideals. Respect, dignity, and fairness, these are the values that hold the Republic together. And in that studio, Palin's words felt like a deliberate fracture. For progressives, immigrants, and anyone who has ever been told they don't look the part, this moment wasn't just about politics. It was about identity. It was about every job interview where someone was judged before they even spoke, every classroom where a child was teased for their accent, every boardroom where a woman's outfit mattered more than her ideas. Palin's mockery carried centuries of echoes, reverberations of exclusion dressed up as humor. And yet that is why it mattered so profoundly that Jasmine Crockett was sitting there, composed, refusing to wilt. Because in her silence, in her refusal to bend, Crockett embodied a truth larger than the insult itself, that dignity cannot be stolen with a sentence. That appearance cannot erase substance. That arrogance, no matter how loudly it sneers, cannot drown out authenticity. As the moment unfolded, viewers across the country were already leaning forward, sensing something bigger than just a clash of personalities. This was no sideshow. It was a referendum on the kind of politics America wanted to embrace, one of cheap mockery and smirks, or one of dignity and resolve. And for those watching, it was impossible not to feel the stakes rising. If Palin's jab went unchallenged, it would send a chilling message that in the highest halls of influence, cruelty was currency, and respect was expendable. But if Crockett responded if she turned this moment on its head, then it could become something else entirely. A flashpoint, a rallying cry, a cultural reset. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every flicker of expression. The audience in the studio and the millions beyond the screen were no longer just spectators. They were participants in a national conversation about dignity and belonging. Every heartbeat seemed to demand the same question. Would this insult stand, or would it be transformed into something unforgettable? And that is why Palin's words carried such weight. They were never just about Jasmine Crockett. They were about the country itself, about whether America still honored the principle that every person deserves respect not because of how they look, but because of who they are and what they contribute. The stage was set. The insult had been fired. The stakes had risen from personal to national, from petty to cultural. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the entire nation were waiting for the hammer to fall. And this was no ordinary exchange. It was about to change everything. To understand why Sarah Palin's words carried such sting, you have to look at the history of the woman behind them. Palin didn't stumble into politics as a servant of the people. She arrived as a performer, a spectacle engineered for headlines. From the moment she burst onto the national stage as John McCain's surprise running mate in 2008, Palin embraced politics not as governance, but as theater. She wielded charisma like a weapon, blending winks with quips, turning every press conference into an audition for the spotlight. But beneath that sparkle was a habit, an instinct to reach not for truth or substance, but for mockery. When policy debates grew too complex, Palin leaned on ridicule. When reporters asked uncomfortable questions, she laughed them off with derision. And when she needed to energize her base, she stoked culture wars with smirks and sarcasm, reducing entire communities to punchlines. Over the years, her pattern became unmistakable. Palin mocked the press as lamestream media, dismissing journalists who dared to challenge her contradictions. She belittled opponents with nicknames and crude shorthand, knowing that insult was easier to digest than analysis. She cultivated an image as the outsider, who thumbed her nose at elitism, all while enjoying the trappings of celebrity politics. Her rallies resembled rock concerts more than forums of democracy chants, jeers, and applause lines, crafted to provoke outrage rather than inspire unity. And Palin thrived in that chaos. She realized early on that media attention, positive or negative, was its own currency. If she could keep cameras pointed at her, she won. If she could trigger liberals into reacting, she doubled her influence. If she could feed her supporters a steady diet of jokes at someone else's expense, she became untouchable in their eyes. This was her playbook: spectacle over service, theater over truth. But what made Palin particularly dangerous wasn't just her wit. It was her arrogance. She believed her charm insulated her from accountability. After all, she could deliver a zinger, wink at the crowd, and walk away smiling while her opponents sputtered in frustration. Her brand was untouchable, or so she thought. That smug confidence became her armor, and over time, it calcified into contempt for institutions, for opponents, and for anyone who didn't play by her rules. When Palin mocked Jasmine Crockett's appearance, it wasn't an isolated slip of the tongue. It was the culmination of years spent perfecting a style of politics that prioritized humiliation over dialogue. Palin had long mastered the art of dragging opponents into the mud, where she could dominate by sheer brazenness. Her insults weren't accidental, they were tactics, sharpened tools designed to diminish, to distract, and to dominate. And the hypocrisy of it all only deepened the frustration. Palin, who once demanded respect as a female politician breaking barriers in the Republican Party, now turned around and used the oldest, cheapest weapon in the book against another woman: appearance-based mockery. The very sexism she had once railed against when it was directed at her became her chosen arsenal when she sought to tear others down. It was arrogance, yes, but it was also insecurity. Because Palin's relevance in the political world had dimmed since her heyday. Her campaigns faltered, her television ventures fizzled, and her attempts to re-enter the national spotlight never reached the same fever pitch. What remained was the performance, the instinct to shock, to provoke, to reclaim a sliver of attention by any means necessary. And so when she mocked Crockett, it wasn't just cruelty. It was desperation wrapped in smugness, a last-ditch effort to remind the world she could still deliver a headline. The audience watching that night didn't need a history lesson to feel the weight of Palin's arrogance. They had seen it before. They remembered the smirks, the winks, the insults. They remembered how she turned politics into a sideshow and mocked the very dignity she claimed to represent. Her comment about Crockett's appearance was not a surprise. It was the inevitable next act in a play she had been performing for more than a decade. And yet, the problem with arrogance is that it blinds. Palin was so certain her performance would land, so confident her insult would sting, that she failed to recognize the strength of the woman sitting across from her. In mocking Crockett, she assumed the same rules applied, that dignity would bow to derision, that composure would crumble before cruelty. But Palin had no idea the woman she was mocking was built for moments just like this. To understand why Jasmine Crockett's composure in that studio carried such weight, you have to trace the journey that brought her there. Crockett's story is not one of privilege or shortcuts. It is a story stitched together by resilience, grit, and an unwavering belief that dignity is not granted by those in power. It is claimed by those who refuse to surrender it. Born and raised in St. Louis, Crockett grew up in a world that didn't always see her potential. She knew early what it felt like to be underestimated, to have people look at her skin, her hair, her presence, and make silent calculations about where she belonged. But she also knew something else: the fire that comes from refusing to accept those limits. Education became her weapon. While others doubted, she doubled down, studying late, debating fiercely, preparing herself not just to survive in a system designed to overlook her, but to thrive in it. Her path led her to law school, where she sharpened her mind into a scalpel. While many of her classmates chased prestige or corporate salaries, Crockett's compass pointed toward service. She became a public defender, stepping into courtrooms where the forgotten and voiceless often faced the full weight of the justice system with no one to shield them. It was in those halls, under flickering fluorescent lights and the hum of overloaded dockets, that she discovered her calling. She wasn't just arguing cases, she was standing between the vulnerable and the abyss. Day after day, she watched as the poor, the marginalized, and the misunderstood were processed like paperwork. And day after day, she fought to make sure their humanity was not erased. The work was exhausting, thankless, but transformative. Crockett saw the raw edges of America, its inequities, its racial disparities, its crushing cycles of poverty. And instead of despairing, she chose to fight harder. That fight propelled her into politics, not because she craved the spotlight, but because she recognized the limits of defending one person at a time. The systemic problems she faced in courtrooms demanded systemic solutions. Elected office wasn't a career move. It was a battlefield. And Crockett, armed with the discipline of the law and the moral compass of service, stepped into the arena. She carried with her the scars of struggle, moments when she was dismissed, mocked or doubted, but also the strength those scars created. She knew what it meant to work twice as hard for half the recognition. She knew what it meant to be told to sit down, only to rise taller. Every challenge she faced became part of her arsenal, proof that she could weather storms others couldn't even imagine. And perhaps most importantly, Crockett carried values. She believed in dignity, not as a slogan, but as a practice. She believed in justice, not as an abstract principle, but as a responsibility. And she believed in representation not just for herself, but for every child watching who needed proof that their voice, too, belonged in the conversation. When Crockett entered the political stage, she did so with a rare blend of sharp intelligence and unshakable authenticity. She wasn't afraid to speak truth, even when it made others uncomfortable. She wasn't afraid to challenge hypocrisy, even when it came from those with more power, more money, or more influence. And she wasn't afraid to carry herself with a dignity that reminded everyone watching she belonged here. That authenticity resonated with people who had grown tired of theater and smirks. To them, Crockett wasn't a politician playing a role. She was the real thing, someone whose voice carried the weight of lived experience, someone who couldn't be rattled by cheap insults or silenced by condescension. She had faced too much, overcome too much, and built too much resilience to fold under the pressure of mockery. So when Palin mocked her appearance in that studio, Crockett's response was never going to be a mere comeback. It was going to be the culmination of years of struggle, service, and sacrifice. Every courtroom battle, every doubting glance, every dismissive smirk she had endured had prepared her for this moment. Palin saw only an opportunity to score a laugh. Crockett saw an opportunity to make history. And that's why the audience leaned forward. That's why millions watching at home felt a strange mixture of outrage and anticipation. They weren't just waiting for Crockett to respond. They were waiting for her to embody every lesson her journey had taught her, to transform a petty insult into something unforgettable. Because for Crockett, this wasn't just about defending herself. It was about defending dignity itself. It was about showing that you cannot mock away the worth of a woman who has carried communities on her shoulders, fought injustice in the trenches, and stared down adversity without blinking. She had been underestimated before. She had been mocked before. She had been told she didn't belong before. And every single time she had risen. And so when Palin launched her insult, Crockett's reply was not just personal. It was historic. The air in the studio had not yet settled when Palin leaned back in her chair, clearly pleased with herself. The smirk on her face was the kind that dared anyone to challenge her. She thought she had landed the blow. And perhaps in her mind, the silence that followed meant victory. But silence can be deceiving. Silence can be the sound of pressure building, the pause before a storm. Instead of letting the moment fade, Palin chose to double down. With a dismissive laugh, she gestured toward Crockett again, as though the first insult hadn't been enough. She framed it as humor, a light-hearted quip meant to draw more chuckles from the audience. But there were no chuckles this time, only the faint shifting of bodies in seats, the weight of discomfort pressing down. Her attempt at arrogance now bordered on desperation, and the crowd could feel it. Crockett, however, sat still, her eyes fixed forward, her expression unchanged. It was a masterclass in composure. Every second she refused to react was another second Palin's arrogance curdled in the air. Crockett wasn't just holding her ground. She was letting Palin dig her own hole, deeper and deeper with every smug attempt at control. The host, sensing the tension, tried to redirect the conversation back to policy, back to the topic at hand. But Palin wouldn't let it go. She interrupted, weaving another barb into her response. It was clear now. This wasn't about ideas for her. It was about dominance, about reducing the debate to a theater of taunts. The audience shifted again, some visibly restless, others whispering to one another. They knew they were no longer watching a debate, they were watching a standoff. The studio lights seemed harsher now, throwing every gesture into sharper relief. Palin's laugh rang louder, more forced. Crockett's silence grew heavier, more deliberate. Each second built suspense like the tightening of a drum. For those watching at home, it was excruciating and electrifying all at once. They wanted Crockett to answer, to fire back, to reclaim the space. And yet there was power in her restraint. Because in politics, timing is everything. Respond too quickly and you risk being drowned in the noise. Wait too long and the moment might pass. But Crockett knew exactly what she was doing. Every heartbeat she remained composed made Palin look smaller, pettier. Every second she withheld her voice made the anticipation grow stronger. Viewers could feel it in their bones. When Crockett finally spoke, it would not be ordinary. Palin, sensing that her jabs weren't landing the way she had hoped, grew louder. Her hand gestures became sharper, her tone more defensive, masked as bravado. It was the classic mistake of the arrogant mistaking volume for strength, mistaking bluster for dominance. And with each exaggerated motion, she revealed what Crockett already knew, that confidence rooted in cruelty always crumbles under pressure. Meanwhile, Crockett's calm began to draw the audience to her side. People who had gasped at the insult were now leaning in, waiting. On social media, clips of the exchange were already circulating. Viewers tweeted about Crockett's poise, about the quiet strength radiating from her presence. The narrative was shifting before she even opened her mouth. Palin thought she was in control, but the country was already reassigning the roles. Palin wasn't the confident star. She was the heckler. And Crockett wasn't the target. She was the storm on the horizon. The tension reached its peak when Palin, almost sneering now, waved her hand dismissively as if Crockett's very presence was beneath her. It was the final straw, the gesture that laid bare the contempt driving her words. The room felt it. The audience at home felt it. This wasn't just mockery anymore, it was an attempt to erase dignity. And that, everyone knew, could not stand unanswered. The moment had stretched to its breaking point. The air crackled with suspense, as if the studio itself was holding its breath. Every eye was fixed on Crockett. Every camera was trained on her face, and the audience, both inside the room and across the country, leaned in with the same expectation. Then, with the world watching, Crockett finally spoke. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hang in suspension. Palin's laughter still echoed faintly, but the energy in the room had shifted. The cameras zoomed in. Crockett lifted her chin just slightly, exhaled slowly, and let the silence stretch to the breaking point. It wasn't hesitation, it was calculation. She was letting the weight of the insult hover long enough for everyone to feel its sting, to taste the arrogance dripping from Palin's words, and then, with a voice steady as steel and measured with precision, she began. "Governor Palin," Crockett said, each syllable deliberate. "It's fascinating that in a room meant for ideas, for visions about America's future, all you can muster is commentary about how I look." The audience stiffened, a ripple of anticipation running through the rows. Palin's smile faltered just slightly, like a performer realizing the script had been flipped. Crockett didn't raise her voice, didn't match Palin's bluster. She spoke with the calm authority of someone who had weathered storms far more dangerous than a smirk across a table. "You see," she continued, "this isn't about my hair or my face or whatever else you think is fair game. This is about respect. Respect for women. Respect for black women. Respect for anyone who dares to step into this arena and fight for something bigger than themselves." The silence was deafening now. Viewers leaned forward, drawn in not by volume but by gravity. Palin shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her arms crossing defensively, her gaze darting away from Crockett's steady eyes. Crockett pressed on, her voice gaining momentum. "When you attack my appearance, you're not just mocking me. You're mocking every little girl watching this broadcast who wonders if she belongs in these spaces. You're mocking every working woman who has been judged for how she looks, before she's been heard for what she says. And you're mocking the very idea that leadership is about character, not cosmetics." Gasps and murmurs spread through the audience. Some clapped instinctively, only to stop themselves, as if unsure whether it was too soon. But Crockett wasn't pausing for applause. She was building, layer upon layer, brick upon brick, crafting a takedown so complete it left no escape hatch. "Now," she said, her tone sharpening just slightly, "I didn't come here tonight to talk about hair and makeup. I came here to talk about justice. I came here to talk about health care. I came here to talk about opportunity for people who've been locked out for too long. That's what matters to the people I serve. That's what matters to this country." Palin shifted again, the confidence visibly draining from her posture. Her smirk had hardened into something closer to a grimace. She opened her mouth, then closed it, realizing any interruption would look like desperation. Crockett's delivery became almost surgical. "And maybe that's why you go for insults, Governor. Because deep down, you know that when it comes to substance, you have nothing to offer. You've spent your career chasing sound bites, chasing cameras, chasing applause lines. But governing? Building something lasting? That takes more than a smirk. It takes service. It takes sacrifice. It takes heart." The room erupted in applause this time, spontaneous and uncontrollable. The host tried to calm the audience, but the energy was volcanic now. People were on their feet. Some cheered. Some laughed in disbelief. Palin's face reddened under the lights, her practiced smile now stretched and brittle. Crockett didn't bask in the applause. She waited, composed, letting it roll over her like a tide. And when it quieted, she leaned forward, eyes locked on Palin, her voice softer but more piercing than ever. So if you think you can define me or any woman by what we look like, I promise you, you are in for a long and humiliating education. Because we are here, we are leading, and no insult, no mockery, no sneer is going to change that fact. The final words landed like thunder. The studio froze and then erupted. Cheers, claps, whistles. The host struggled to regain order, but it was hopeless. The audience was electrified, carried on a wave of catharsis. They had just witnessed a reversal, the kind of moment that feels like history being written in real time. Palin sat stiffly, her eyes fixed downward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Gone was the swagger, the smirk, the air of untouchable arrogance. In its place was the unmistakable posture of someone who had been bested utterly, irrevocably, and it wasn't just the studio audience. Across the country, millions of viewers were already clipping the exchange, sharing it, quoting it. Hashtags were beginning to form even as Crockett's words lingered in the air. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, every platform was catching fire. People weren't just impressed. They were moved. They saw in Crockett not just a politician, but a defender of dignity itself. Palin had set the stage for mockery. Crockett had turned it into a lesson. And in doing so, she didn't just win the exchange, she transformed it into a cultural moment, one that people would point to for years, as proof that arrogance always crumbles in the face of dignity. As the applause thundered, as the crowd rose to its feet, one truth became inescapable. Palin had underestimated her opponent. She thought she was sparring with someone ordinary. Instead, she had collided with someone extraordinary. And the beauty of it was in the calm, in the composure, in the unshakable grace with which Crockett dismantled the insult. It was the kind of response that required not just intelligence, but courage. Not just sharp words, but lived conviction. The cameras captured it all, the pride in Crockett's eyes, the discomfort etched into Palin's face, the electricity in the room. It was a mic drop in every sense of the word, a moment so definitive that it needed no repetition, no embellishment, but the shockwaves didn't stop in the studio. They spread everywhere. By the time the cameras cut to commercial, the internet had already erupted. Within minutes, clips of Crockett's takedown flooded social media feeds, spreading faster than wildfire. The silence before her words, the calm precision of her delivery, the eruption of applause, all of it was cut, looped, remixed, and shared across platforms. On Twitter, hashtags like Nodder Crockett clapback and Dignity Wins shot to the top of the trending list. TikTok creators stitched the moment into dances, reaction videos, and tearful commentaries. Instagram was filled with reels of young women nodding in solidarity, their captions reading, "This is why representation matters." The memes came next. Palin's smirk froze in time, paired with captions like, "When you think you're the star, but you're actually the setup." Another showed Crockett's poised face with the words, "Strength isn't loud, it's unshakable." Late-night comedians wasted no time either. By the evening's monologues, the exchange had already been elevated to cultural shorthand. Palin's insult as the cheap joke, Crockett's reply as the mic drop that reminded America what leadership looks like. Commentators across the spectrum scrambled to weigh in. Progressive voices hailed Crockett as a force of dignity and truth. Cable news panels replayed the clip on a loop, dissecting her delivery like it was a historic speech rather than a debate response. One anchor declared, "We just witnessed the moment Jasmine Crockett became a household name." Even celebrities joined the chorus. Musicians, actors, athletes figures with millions of followers tweeted their admiration. One pop star wrote, "She didn't just clap back, she gave every woman watching the courage to hold their head high." Another celebrity quipped, "Palin brought shade, but Crockett brought the storm." Meanwhile, Palin's allies scrambled. Some attempted to spin the moment as overblown, insisting it was just a joke gone wrong. Others tried to pivot the conversation back to policy. But the narrative had already crystallized, and no amount of spin could erase the viral truth. Palin had mocked, and Crockett had obliterated her with dignity. For Palin, the fallout was brutal. Clips of her grimacing under Crockett's words circulated as much as the insult itself. Editorials branded her tactic as outdated, a relic of mean-spirited politics that no longer resonated. What once played as cheeky now felt like cruelty, and cruelty, especially against someone who embodied resilience and composure, was no longer a winning strategy. For Crockett, however, the moment expanded her platform overnight. Her follower counts surged by the tens of thousands. Grassroots organizations reached out to amplify her message. Students and young activists posted videos calling her their role model. Parents shared clips with their children, using the moment as a lesson about strength in the face of ridicule. And there was something deeper in the reaction, too, something raw. Viewers weren't just applauding a clever comeback, they were celebrating validation. They were seeing a woman who looked like them, who carried herself with poise and intelligence, refusing to be reduced to a punchline. For immigrants, for women of color, for anyone who had been told they didn't belong, Crockett's response felt personal. It was as though she had spoken not just for herself, but for them. Social media captured the collective catharsis. Tweets read, "I've been waiting my whole life to see someone respond like that." That wasn't just a debate, it was justice in real time. And perhaps most tellingly, she didn't just win. She changed the rules. But alongside the celebration was a quieter recognition. Commentators began asking why these kinds of insults were tolerated in the first place, and whether politics had lost too much dignity in the pursuit of spectacle. Crockett's response wasn't just a personal victory. It reopened a national conversation about what America expects from its leaders. The ripple effect was undeniable. By the following morning, headlines framed it as a cultural moment. Editorial boards praised Crockett's composure. Scholars wrote op-eds about the intersection of race, gender, and power. Talk shows invited experts to analyze why the moment resonated so deeply. It wasn't just that she had responded. It was how she responded, with calm clarity that made Palin's arrogance look small in comparison. And as the conversation spread, it became clear this was no ordinary debate. It was a reckoning, a reminder that America is still wrestling with who belongs in its halls of power and who gets mocked for daring to step inside. The laughter Palin sought had turned against her. The dignity Crockett embodied had transformed into a rallying cry, and the nation, for a rare moment, seemed united in its recognition that something important had happened. And yet, beyond the noise, one lesson rose above it all. When the noise of the crowd and the flood of social media reactions began to settle, what remained was the echo of something far larger than a single exchange. Jasmine Crockett had not merely answered an insult, she had reframed it, transforming mockery into a mirror that reflected America's deeper struggle between arrogance and dignity, vanity and values, ego and service. She stood as proof that leadership is not measured in the sharpness of an insult, but in the strength of composure. Palin had tried to belittle, to shrink the moment into a cheap laugh. Crockett, by contrast, expanded it into a lesson. She showed that when faced with contempt, the most powerful response isn't to return fire with fire, but to rise above with grace so undeniable that the insult collapses under its own weight. Her message cut to the heart of what Americans say they value: respect, decency, the idea that every person deserves to be seen for the substance of their character rather than the surface of their appearance. Crockett's reply carried those ideals like a banner, reminding the nation that dignity does not whisper, it roars, even when spoken softly. And in that roar, people heard themselves. Workers who had been dismissed because of how they looked, students who had been teased for their accents or their clothes, women who had been judged more for their bodies than for their brilliance, immigrants who had been told they didn't fit the image of real Americans. Crockett's response told them what they already knew, but needed to feel affirmed. You belong, your voice matters, and your worth is not up for debate. By lifting the insult onto a higher plane, Crockett turned Palin's tactic inside out. She exposed the fragility of mockery, showing that ridicule can never match resilience. In doing so, she reminded America that its greatness has never been built on arrogance, but on courage, not on sneers but on service, not on vanity, but on values that endure long after the cameras stop rolling. Her words didn't just silence Palin, they uplifted an audience hungry for proof that politics could still inspire. They reminded viewers that the fight for dignity is not abstract. It lives in these moments, in how leaders treat one another, in how they model respect for the next generation. Crockett's response was more than a comeback. It was a compass, pointing toward the America people want to believe in. The lasting lesson wasn't about Palin's insult, it was about Crockett's refusal to be defined by it. And in that refusal lay a blueprint for all who face mockery, exclusion, or dismissal. Stand tall, speak truth, and never let arrogance dictate your worth, because in the end, this wasn't just about two women, it was about all of us. Sarah Palin may have thought she was delivering a clever jab, but history will remember it differently. What began as a moment of mockery ended as a masterclass in dignity. Jasmine Crockett turned insult into inspiration, arrogance into ashes, and in doing so, she left not just a studio, but an entire nation stunned. That's the power of courage, spoken with clarity. That's the impact of choosing values over vanity. Palin's words were meant to wound, but Crockett's response healed something far deeper. The belief that truth, when delivered with grace, still triumphs over cruelty. And as we look back on this exchange, the title of this story tells itself. Palin mocked. Crockett responded. And the world will not forget the silence, the calm, and then the eruption that followed. But here's the part that matters most. This isn't just Jasmine Crockett's victory. It's ours. It's for everyone who's been told they don't belong. Everyone who's been ridiculed for daring to show up. Everyone who has had to fight to be heard. Her moment reminds us that we are not alone, that dignity still has defenders, and that arrogance always crumbles in the face of truth. So if this moment spoke to you, if it made you feel proud, if it made you want to stand taller, if it reminded you that respect is worth fighting for, then don't let it end here. Join this movement of voices that believe in something better. Share this story. Subscribe to stay connected. And add your voice to a growing chorus demanding dignity in our politics and in our lives. Because when we stand together, no insult can define us. Only our values can, and those values are stronger than any mockery.